Welcome to the Inside Carolina podcast. I am your host, Tommy Ashley. I am joined by a crew of sorts. Before we get into that, I need to ask you to take time to review us and rate us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, 5-star ratings, and leave ratings. If you want to leave us some comments, tell me how bad we're doing, how good we're doing, whatever. As long as you leave a rating with
Mostly
5
how
stars.
good we're doing.
Absolutely. But, I like to give people options. Do it. Leave us those ratings. It helps us help you get your podcast content. And also, sponsor is Johnny T-Shirt. Support them. Even after Christmas, even after all the sales they've always had, they're always looking for business, and they're always taking care of our subscribers and our customers. And, of course, you get 10% off your order. The crew I have, you've heard one voice, the voice of Buck Sanders. I've got Greg Barnes, and I've got Jason Staples with me. I do not know exactly how to title this, so we'll call it a roundtable, and we'll call it a look back, look forward Carolina football version inside Carolina Roundtable. Buck, I'll come to you first. We haven't talked since the Orange Bowl, and I was watching that game thinking I was watching the 2021 season, and that's pretty much what it was. But your overall take and thoughts on that game, but since then with everything that's gone on.
Well, I would call this a square table since there's only 4 of us, as opposed to a round table.
Leave it to El Jefe to make trouble.
Good trouble. I make good trouble.
We need some of that.
We didn't have our normal day after podcast after the Orange Bowl, and I would disagree, I think, pretty strongly with the idea that we were watching the 2021 Tar Heels in the Orange Bowl. I think there's a lot that's going to happen, and a lot that is going to happen organically between what we saw at the Orange Bowl and what we're going to see in 2021. We're going to try to keep this first segment of the podcast focused on 2020, and we'll get into 2021 in the second half. But I really don't. I think there's going to be a lot of difference, actually, particularly on the defensive side, and very likely a lot of difference on the offensive side, particularly when it comes to the running game, between what we saw in the Orange Bowl and what we're going to see in 2021. Be happy to get into that, in this, the second half of the podcast. But, I think what we saw in the Orange Bowl was the UNC doing the best they could with what they had on short notice, with 4,000 yards of offense missing. I think we'll see something much different when it comes to 2021. But I don't think there's much takeaway that we can get into for the 2020 season, just basing it off of the off the Orange Bowl. Texas A&M was a very good defensive team. I mentioned this in one of my columns, but British Brooks had as good a stat line against Texas A&M as Najee Harris of Alabama did. So I just don't think you can draw a lot of conclusions from what you saw in the Orange Bowl and extrapolate out to the 2021 season. And I'll yield back the rest of my time on this topic, to capture the current state of affairs in the United States.
To the leader, Greg, I'll get it to you first, because 2020 was historic in many different ways. I'm looking at the stats, and I know you've got them, but 500 points on the nose for this offense in 12 games seems impressive. What saith you about the level that this team played at over the course of this season?
Well, Tommy, we can do this 2 ways. You may give you my take on the Orange Bowl real quick, or do you want me to dive into these season stats?
Yeah, go ahead and give me your take. And I don't, Buck doesn't agree with me. He agrees with me a lot, but he doesn't agree with me this time. It felt different. That team that I watched in the Orange Bowl in Miami Gardens felt a lot different than the team I watched 2 weeks before that.
I don't disagree with that point, Tommy. I'm just disagree where you think what we saw in the Orange Bowl is what we're going to see in 2021. That's my point.
Okay, I agree with that. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, I would say I agree with Buck because what we saw in the Orange Bowl is not enough if North Carolina wants to be a legitimate national type team. The reason I say that is I had some conversations with some people on the boards about this after the game. And for me, it's a relevant conversation. You guys may disagree. But if you look at what happened against Notre Dame and Texas A&M, two legitimate top 5 teams, when it mattered in the fourth quarter, UNC was outscored 31-7. Offensively, yards-wise, it was 310 to 134. A&M and the Irish averaged 9.1 yards per play. UNC averaged 4.2 yards per play. Those two teams had 198 rushing yards in the fourth quarter. UNC had -8. Of course, sacks play into that. This is a North Carolina podcast, so I imagine everybody is aware of how Roy Williams does things and what Roy has always says. He doesn't even look at the scoreboard in the first half. It serves no purpose. He wants to see how his team is playing because his philosophy is talent will win out. And he wants to get up and down the court. He wants to rotate guys in so that by the time you get to the final 5 minutes, the other team is in foul trouble and those guys are gassed. And that gives his team a legitimate advantage when it matters. What did Mack Brown say after the Syracuse game? He actually kind of shot back at the fans a little bit because the fans were upset that it was 10-6 entering the fourth quarter. What'd he say? They're not counting by quarters. It's how you finish the game that matters. North Carolina outscored Syracuse 21-0 in that fourth quarter because North Carolina was clearly the better team. They just had not played up to it to that point. I'm not taking away from what North Carolina did early against Notre Dame and early against Texas A&M. What I am saying is that North Carolina has a big step to take to reach that level because they have to build depth, they have to do better executing, and they have to be better all the way around. And so I think we have to be cautious, and this is why I think Buck is right, and I think Mack's right. This team has a long ways to go. The expectations are there. The fact that you have a guy like Sam Howell is critically important. But I think what we saw against A&M is this team is well coached. They have some good players. And when you can do that, you can play. But when it got down to crunch time, the talent rose up. And Texas A&M was clearly the better team in the fourth quarter, just like Notre Dame was clearly the better team in the fourth quarter. That was my takeaway from the Orange Bowl.
Jason, I'll bring you in here before we get into the numbers a little bit. That is what I saw. I saw a Carolina team that has talent in the first 22, but could not man up beyond that. And that's the level. That's the difference in the levels between 8-3 and 10-11-1 on a consistent basis. What did you see?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also saw a team in Texas A&M that was a little more physical than North Carolina for the most part on the night. And this was an interesting styles matchup in that, and just like with the Notre Dame game, Texas A&M and Notre Dame were those boxers that are going to go body blow, body blow, body blow, body blow, body blow through the whole match. And they're just going to try to take away your legs. And then by the time you're weakened a little bit from the broken ribs you've gotten a few times in the match, then you've lost your power. You're finally staggering a little bit, and then they finally blow to the head late in they get you in the fourth quarter. And that's the Alabama formula for years before Alabama landed all the playmakers that now they can basically do whatever they want offensively. But it's the slow cooker type thing, and that's kind of what I saw. Now, I did see a North Carolina team that has enough playmakers and has a good enough quarterback where they made some big plays that kept them in the ball game. I mean, I look at the stat line here, and this game was a close game, and North Carolina had every chance to win this game in the fourth quarter. But then you look at the stat line and you go, huh, interesting. I mean, North Carolina was outgained by a lot more than I thought in terms of yards per play. I mean, I'm looking at it now. Average yards per play. Texas A&M averaged 7.5 yards per play. North Carolina averaged 5. Normally, that's going to translate into about a 14-point loss, maybe a little more. And even with that bad interception, that turnover early, North Carolina was still in the ball game despite being outgained like that per play. And yes, the 75-yarder did matter, but there were some big plays on Carolina's side as well. They were in the ball game. They found ways to win some situations to keep themselves in the game. So that's a good sign for being able to compete down the line, is that this team rose up and managed to do some important things in key situations, particularly Josh Downs with those couple big plays that he had. That those were crucial. At the same point, though, that tells you a little bit of how far, again, like what Greg said, how far Carolina has to go. And I think if you dig a little deeper into the numbers as well, and I know you said before we get to the numbers, but I'm gonna go with them because I had them sitting here ready to go. When you look a little bit more at the numbers, you can kind of see how this worked. In first quarter, the two teams were even in average yards per play, 3.2 yards per play. Second quarter, Carolina averaged 6.2 yards per play, Texas A&M 9.3. So as the half went on, A&M was able to sort of exert their will a little bit more. Second half, Carolina comes out. Third quarter, Carolina averages 5.0 yards per play. Texas A&M averages 5.5. Things right back to pretty close to even in the third quarter. And then as the half goes on, what happens? Fourth quarter, Texas A&M averaged 10.7 yards per play. Now that's bolstered by that long late touchdown. But even without that, they're at about 7.5. And Carolina's at 5.5. That right there tells you exactly in number form what Greg was just talking about in terms of you had one team that just, they had enough players and they had the coaching staff to be able to compete early in each half. And then as adjustments got made, as you start getting the backups or as you start getting guys that get a little bit tired, the team with better players down the roster won the football game. And the other thing that you could see is A&M was a more mature football team on both lines of scrimmage, was a more mature team in general, just physically. If you looked at those guys and you looked at Carolina, you'd say, yeah, they look like a group of upperclassmen who have been in the Texas A&M weight program for a while, and they've eaten well. And North Carolina still has a little ways to go to look like that on the hoof. And so, this is where next year, I think Buck's right that next year defensively, Carolina's going to look different than they did in this game because of some of the bodies that they're going to be able to rotate on the defensive line. They're going to be another step closer to what you saw at Texas A&M there. But the one place where I do think it looked like the 2021 team is on the offensive side. I think you're going to see a lot more of what we did on the offensive side just because of some of the limitations without Carter and Williams, who, I think the biggest reason that this game looked so different, why it felt like a different team, is all year this team was about Carter and Williams in the backfield. And in this game, it was Sam Howell, period. They didn't have that the identity this year has been running backs first, and then Howell as a really, really good sidekick. This game was Sam Howell as both the protagonist and the sidekick, and they're going to need to find some ways to give him a little bit more help in 2021 as well. But those were my initial observations from this game, and I think it says a lot about where Carolina is as a program and how close they are in a lot of areas and how far they have to go in some others.
Yeah, I think the depth and the lines or the building block, there's blocks there, but not near enough. But what do you say to to the Inside Carolina message board poster that says if Joffrey Brown doesn't drop that touchdown, Carolina likely or very likely wins that game. Because that's when I felt like it was over. When that happened, I felt like game was over. And then
you got to take advantage of every one of those opportunities.
Yeah, and that is, I guess, the levels of the two teams. Carolina missed one opportunity there, and it cost them the game. Texas A&M didn't have to rely on that so much. But, I mean, what do you say to the fan base to sort of ease back on maybe some expectations coming out of that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, oh, what a Merry Christmas we'd all have.
I have missed you, Buck, and I had a Merry Christmas with a bunch of candy.
Here, I thought you were going to talk about your aunt initially, and when you were going to respond to this one instead of Christmas. But Christmas is a refreshing change here, Buck.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't like to get into the the scatology part of making comparisons, but we get back to and Greg spilled a ton of ink about this last year in the spring portion of at least, and even into the fall. I'm old enough to remember when Mack Brown got cussed out because he had bad hands. None of the UNC receivers could catch a cold. They were dropping balls all over the place, and there was big concern from the coaching staff that we got too many drop passes and blah, blah, blah. Well, if I was projecting forward, I would say in the spring we'll have that same conversation about receivers' hands and who's catching what and this, that, and the other. And then by the time we get to the fall, there'll be less of that conversation. By the time we get to mid-season of 2021, you'll start seeing UNC receivers making spectacular catches. And in fact, we saw that in 2019 in the first game. Mack Brown and Daz Newsome starting to make some spectacular catches, although they'll also have some inexplicable drops. So, you can't base whether you win or lose a game on, well, this running back had a 76-yard run. If it wasn't for that, we'd have run the game. That's not how football works. And you can't say, well, if Joffrey Brown had caught that ball, we were going to win. You don't know, had he caught that ball, what would have happened after that. There might have been adjustments on the other side. That's really no way to analyze a game. What happened. And what matters is, just like in a fight, if you get knocked down, it matters more about what you do after that. Do you get back up? Do you fight at that point? So, I would say if you're wasting your time talking about whether Joffrey Brown had caught that ball or not, you're truly wasting your time. And so that's my answer to your question, Tommy.
It reminds me of that Jordan meme or that Jordan GIF where it says, just stop it. Just stop. Greg, I know you want to talk about numbers because you're our numbers guy. And I have to wrap my head around the numbers I see and remember it's just in 12 games. But talk to us about them.
Yeah, and I just looked this up while Buck was talking because it was a good point. Last year, this talks about – this kind of speaks to progress, right? It's baby steps, but it's enough where you can see it. North Carolina had 32 drop passes in 2019. Granted, that was 13 games. 12 games this year, only 17. And that's the progression you've got to make. And next year, because you're losing Daz and Diami, as Buck says, maybe those numbers go back up a little bit. But the more you build talent, those kind of things lessen. And that's kind of what you want. You want to round things out and polish the edges. Just kind of looking back on 2020 football season, It's been a hell of a year. What's interesting to me, and we've talked about this quite a bit on this podcast, is what you see on the message board in terms of criticism directed at coordinators doesn't match up with kind of what the stats say. Bateman has been given
especially with Phil Longo. Let me interject there. I mean, you got like what, the 4th, 5th, 6th best offense in the nation, and fire the bomb. I mean, what are we doing here? You know,
the best offense in UNC football history, and
there you go.
Like I'm taking crazy pills.
and Bateman's been given a pass. Now, Longo had known quantities, whereas Bateman did not. We all know what Bateman was kind of dealing with. But even so, so going through some of these numbers, looking at a bunch of different ones. The one, kind of the stock one I'll look at quite a bit is yards per play. The offense averaged 7.6, which is 5th best in the country. That is the highest number in school history. That's quite impressive. Defensively, UNC was 75th nationally in allowing 5.8 yards per play. Scoring, offense was 10th nationally, 41.7. Defense was 65th in scoring defense, 29.4. And then 2 of the advanced metrics that we've always kind of looked at is S&P plus and then FEI, Brian Femo's per possession scoring advantage. Offense was 7th in FEI, which means that, against an average opponent, per possession, they were averaging 1.48 points more than the average offense. It's a really good offense. Defensively, UNC was 90th. And again, an average defense was allowing 0.47, about half a point less than what North Carolina was. And then S&P plus, which is more kind of efficiency based, the offense once again was 6th and defense was 52nd. So S&P plus had the defense a little bit better than the FEI. But I think the main thing there is offense is 7th, 6th, and 5th in 3 key metrics. Incredible job by Phil Longo in this offense for what they did. Very impressive. And that was against, according to Sagarin, that's against the 65th toughest schedule. So it wasn't a hard schedule, even though once we got into December and, of course, January, North Carolina played some really good teams.
Let me, before I jump to Jason on that, Greg, red zone, because that's the one thing, if I had a criticism, that's the one area that I hear the most about.
Let's be honest, you do have a criticism.
I said if. I'm just the host. I'm just
and
asking
Greg,
questions.
if you can't handle this, I'm happy to jump in for you.
No, I've got it. I am pulling it up right now. I think what everybody needs to know is that there was legitimate beef with Phil Longo because his offenses at Ole Miss, while they were explosive, they really struggled scoring touchdowns in the red zone. And same issue occurred last year. This year has been that situation, converting 73.2% in the red zone as touchdowns. That was tops in the ACC. And let's see here, drum roll. That is actually 15th nationally. So again, phenomenal. Fire Phil. That should be the hashtag this offseason. Fire Phil.
And that wheel route to Josh Downs for the touchdown, that's as good a design play call as I've ever seen in the red zone.
Good luck having a linebacker cover that guy out of the backfield.
Yeah,
that ain't happening. And there was the nice wrinkle out of that. And I'm actually gonna do like a 2-minute video on this, or minute and a half video. The nice wrinkle on that is having your receiver not just run a shallow toward the running back, but have him run a zig route so that he actually sits down and then starts coming back outside. So there's like 3 opportunities to make sure that he's screening off that backer. It's that much harder to get over, and that's a nice little wrinkle that you don't normally see in that version of a rub route, or as defensive coaches like to call it, a pick play. But yeah, that was great. Now, I will say I still think just in certain things that there was reason for beef at times against better teams in the red zone this year. And if you've got Javonte Williams, you dang well better be good in the red zone. Because
I think Phil went to that option a lot more in 2020 than he did 2019.
Yeah, and you could see against Texas A&M how big a difference that made when they got into the red zone, and also on that last third and fourth down attempts. Both of those are plays where odds are Carter or Williams, but especially Williams, get the first down, and they didn't there because, well, you don't have a guy who's a top NFL prospect at the position running the ball. You've got a guy that's younger and it's going to take a little time to develop. So there's going to be some adjustment, I'm sure, there that they're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, we'll talk about the adjustments need to be made after the break. But Buck, I'm gonna let you close the season on 2020. Let's talk about our grades, our ABCD grades on this team compared to what we expected when we did this roundtable season prediction show. I'm so terrible at it. I might have to get rid of that one. But how do you think this team matched up with your expectations in August?
Well, Greg and Jason will probably, refute me on this. But my preseason predictions were like on the money. The only thing I got wrong
was the record.
The Virginia game. The Virginia game. Yeah, I got the record wrong. But you and Jason both picked games outside of what happened actually on the field. So I was going to throw some sort of epithet in there, but I'll restrain myself in that regard. But, the thing that I think I probably underestimated and something I'll keep my eye on next year, and I think Mack has already spoken to this like a dozen times since the season ended, is that I underestimated the ability of UNC to lose to teams that they shouldn't lose to. They shouldn't have lost to Virginia. They shouldn't have lost to Florida State. And Mack has spoken to that. And I think the biggest takeaway probably for me in the entire 2020 season is the ability of North Carolina moving forward to take a lesson from that Florida State game, which Mack pointed out in his press conference was probably the most important game of the season for this program, not just last season. Moving forward, that, if you want to run with the big boys, you want to, have a nationally respected program, you just can't lose to people that you're supposed to beat, especially not when you're a double-digit favorite. And so I think that's probably the teaching point moving forward for this team is that, when you're playing that team, you're favored by 14, all the metrics show that you should beat them easily. You got to win that game. That's a game you got to win. Now, when you're matched up with a team where the margin of victory is like 0.25 Vegas spread or whatever, stuff can happen. Football is shaped funny. It can bounce funny. You could come out on one end of the score of that or the other. But when you're favored by 14 points, if you don't come out and put your foot on the neck of that team and beat them, then you got no business calling yourself somebody that's nationally relevant. So that's my biggest takeaway. And that's, I think, the next step for this North Carolina program. When you get in those games next year, you got something to prove. We always talk about what teams have to prove against this team or that team. Well, the thing that North Carolina has to prove more than anything is that when they're favored by that number, they got to win that game. That's what they got to prove. So that's where I'm at on my take for the 2020 season. And I agree with Mack that the biggest game, most important game they played in 2020 was against Florida State.
Yeah, you can't crap the bed. and expect to be in the national hunt. Even though I don't think the season ends any differently if they win both of those games. I think they play the Orange Bowl, probably against Texas A&M, maybe as the 5th ranked team or the 6th ranked team. But I think it's pretty similar. Jason, wrap 20 in your mind.
So I do want to ask a question of y'all. Do you have any idea for a 14-point favorite, how often in college football does a 14-point favorite lose, percentage-wise?
Yeah, I've seen that spreadsheet before, but it's rare.
10% of the time.
Yeah, I'd say between 10 and 15% or less.
It is just under 15%. And at the 14 point, it's 14.26% are losses. At 13.5, it's 15.6, and at 14.5, it's 15.24. So basically, you expect to win games that you're favored by 14 points. You expect to win about 85% of those, by and large. So if you want to win more than, let's say you've got an 11-game season. If you want more than 8 wins, you need to be favored by more than 14 in most of your games, which is something to think about for those of you out there, thinking about expectations moving forward. To get down to 10%, you get to the 17-point mark. Once you're favored by 17 or more, you drop into the single digits. So that's really, and what's interesting about that's the 3 possession mark, right? Once you get into the 3 possession area, that's when it takes a lot to lose that game. But I think what that all boils down to in terms of you've got to beat all the teams that you're supposed to and everything. This reminds me of, I saw analysis of Tom Herman's time at Texas not long ago, where they were talking about how Tom Herman was right around 500 in games decided by 1 score or less. And somebody said, well, see, the problem isn't their performance in 1 score or, in games decided by 1 score. The problem is that Texas has played an awful lot of 1-score games in the Tom Herman era. And you can't afford that. If you're a good team, if you're a team that's going to beat teams that you should, you don't get into a lot of 1-score games because you're that much better. And that's the bridge Carolina needs to get to. And so when I wrapped this season, Greg and I both had North Carolina finish with the record that they finished with. We figured this was about where they'd wind up. We both said in the prediction show, like, I'm not sure who that 3rd regular season loss is going to be. I mean, I think both of us we both had Clemson, and then we both had, I think,
Notre Dame.
You had Notre Dame.
Yeah, we both had Clemson and Notre Dame as losses, and
Maybe
then it was
Miami.
just a matter of, and then it was a matter of like who that 3rd loss is going to be. I had Miami, and then Greg famously had Boston College, which actually was a close game. But here's the thing.
Still a laughable prediction.
It was awfully close, guys. But here's the thing. It was one of those things of like, look, there's going to be enough games on the margin here where Carolina's going to be a favored team, but odds of them winning all of those games, given how closely favored they are in terms of overall talent on the field on both sides, they're not likely to win all of those. And so I think in large part, Carolina this season met my expectations, which was to take a sizable step forward in terms of the program and to put themselves in position to be a legitimate contender next year and the year following. So basically, you got to remember 2 years ago, they were a losing football team and had been a losing football team multiple years in a row. And then Mack comes in and they go to suddenly you're winning football team. And then this year, suddenly you're starting to punch above your weight a little bit. And then next year is the first year where it's like, you know what? You expect them to start winning, if not all of the games that they're supposed to, maybe only drop 1 against a fuller schedule. And so you're going, okay, this team's starting to show signs of being this program starting to show signs of maturing into what Mack Brown is trying to build. So this year to me was just a met expectations and completely on schedule for what Mack Brown is trying to build. This was that's to me the summary. My summary of the season is on schedule. They're right where you would expect them to be if they're headed towards what Mack Brown is trying to build.
Greg, nutshell it. 2020.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the Miami game was important. What Buck said and what Max said about Florida State, I think kind of woke him up. And I agree the importance level there. That was kind of a shockingly bad loss. But for North Carolina, if they lose the game at Miami, I think there's a lot of people talking about this team not taking advantage of their potent offense. And then maybe you get some heat on Jay Bateman, and they're playing in the Duke Mayo Bowl possibly. But the way they played against Miami and then the way they played in the Orange Bowl, I think is why everybody is so hyped up. I thought it was funny. Max said, if North Carolina had won the Orange Bowl, expectations would really be through the roof. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. They lost.
Are you not paying attention to what we're saying? Have you met Buck Sanders?
But I agree that North Carolina needed to take some steps forward. We knew that the defensive line was going to be a liability. It was. They needed to show progress. I think there's a lot of talent in the younger classes that's only going to continue. I do think the offense was better than I thought it would be. The defense probably wasn't as good as I thought it could be, even though I knew that the defensive line had some issues. But I think for the most part, after that FSU game, I thought they played well. They didn't play great. And kind of to Jason's point, where Mack wants to take this program, he talked about, Del Royal told him, there's going to be a couple weeks every year where you just are not going to have any idea what your guys are going to do. They're going to come out flat for whatever random reason. And it's not going to be one guy. It's going to be the entire team. And so you want to build up enough talent so that when you step on the field, you're basically a 3-touchdown favorite. And if you play your B game or your C game, like North Carolina did against Syracuse, you're still good enough to scrape by with the win. And you may be on upset alert, but you get the job done. But when you're a 7-point favorite or 10-point favorite, there's a good chance you're going to lose those games. And Virginia, they were a touchdown favorite in Charlottesville. Virginia doesn't have the talent that North Carolina does, but they're well coached and they're tough defensively. And North Carolina had to play well in that game to win, and they didn't play well enough. And so that's going to happen more until you start to see this talent separation. And we can talk about this in the next segment. Does Carolina get there next year, or are we talking about 2 or 3 years down the road? That's the big question mark.
And the other thing to think about there is that a couple weeks in a row, 2-3 weeks in a row, you might be down both of your starting corners. That it's the attrition part of the college football season that every year people seem to forget about. And that's, by the way, one of the best arguments for why, even though I think Ohio State, I'm not sure what their corona situation is right now. I've heard some rumblings that they may not have a full complement there. But if Ohio State has a full roster, I wouldn't be surprised to see them beat Alabama in the national championship game. They've got the players to do it, and I think that quarterback, I think Fields is certainly capable of that kind of performance. But I'm not sure. I mean, this is the best argument against Ohio State being in the playoff. 6 games, you don't have enough opportunity for the attrition and for some of the stuff that happens during a season to cost a team a game to happen to you.
Right.
And that's the thing. And so, that's what you have to get good enough. Like Greg was saying, you have to get good enough as a program to where when it's not all right, when that attrition kicks in, when, when a couple key guys just got dumped by their girlfriends or whatever, when that happens, you have to be good enough that you can compensate for that. And that's when you're on the level of your Clemsons and your Alabamas or whatever, where, well, that guy's just having, those 2 guys are just having a rotten day, or those 2 guys are just injured or whatever. And it doesn't matter because, well, we've got another guy we can pull off the bench and he's still really good. And he's He's got range the moment he steps into the gym.
Yep. Yeah, I think Ohio State has a rib problem just as much as the corona problem. But anyway, I digress. I don't want to make light of the COVID situation. Let's take a short break, talk about Johnny T-Shirt, johnnytshirt.com. I know Mr. Buck Sanders wanted these segments to be short. It's never short when we're together, Buck. So this one's a little bit longer, but while we're talking,
this has already gone as long as I hope the whole podcast would go.
Well, if you need to drop, we understand.
Yeah.
Our
I would
sponsors,
never put up with the harassment I would get if I did that.
You would absolutely get harassed, and Johnny T-Shirt would be disappointed because the bell cow would be dropping out of the podcast. Take a second to go to johnnytshirt.com and visit them and order some stuff. It's wintertime now. It's supposed to snow tomorrow. If you need sweatshirts and sweatpants and things like that, they've got you covered. And they cover our Inside Carolina Premium subscribers with 10% off their order. And they look after us, so let's look after them. Take another short break. Let the national guys pay the bills. We'll be back with the Inside Carolina Square Table, Roundtable podcast. Jason Staples, Buck Sanders, and Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. We'll be right back. All right, boys, we're back. InsideCarolina.com podcast. Jason, Greg, and Buck, and myself. Rate us and review us. Don't forget to do that if you hadn't done it already. Let's talk about 2021. And, Greg, I'm going to start with you first because you brought it up in the last segment. Is it next year that Carolina sort of gets to that level where they can not get out of bed one morning and still win most all their ball games? I think from what I saw in the Orange Bowl makes me believe that the defense might be closer than we thought. Your take?
I think it's a great question because I think you have to take advantage of the talent that you have. And when I say that, I'm specifically referring to Sam Howell. Best quarterback in UNC football history. Everybody assumes that Jacoby Criswell or Drake Mayer is going to step in and be the next best thing. I mean, how many times have we heard that across the country? You just do not know how quarterbacks are going to turn out. We know what Sam Howell is. And so you're in this situation next year where it's going to be his last year in Chapel Hill, most likely. And the offense is pretty much going to return everybody. Now, they have to find a running back. And I think they're going to try to solve that issue through the transfer portal, if possible. So I think you're good there. But defensively, yeah, I mean, how quickly does that talent mature? Because you got Vahasek back, and he had a pretty good year this year. Tamari Fox has been up and down. Tamon Fox coming back is a nice boost. But you really need Murphy or maybe one of the new guys coming in to really take a significant step. Where if you want to put 3 down linemen in the game, you can do that. And you don't have to rely on these outside linebackers who kind of beefed up linebackers to serve as defensive ends. That's probably not your preference if you have the bodies that you want. So I think you're in this unique situation where Jay Bateman really needs to do a good job, and they really need to do a good job this offseason in developing those guys so the defense does play at a higher standard. Because kind of as you allude to, Tommy, the defense in stretches late in the year looked really good. The problem is they weren't full games. They were just stretches of times. Wake Forest, they got 3 consecutive stops. Notre Dame, they looked good for stretches of time until late. Texas A&M, they looked good for stretches of time until late. That needs to play out for the course of the game. Will they be good enough for North Carolina to be favored in pretty much most of their games? Yeah. But you have to avoid kind of the pitfall games as Buck talked about. But then some of the bigger games that you have, the Notre Dame and the Miami and whoever else is going to be good in the Coastal pit, you've got to take advantage of those opportunities, and the defense has to be good enough if Sam Howell and the offense don't play at their A level, which we saw a few times this year. And so I think that's kind of the challenge is 2 years from now, no question, the defense will be there. Can you speed things up enough where it's next year so it can be the special year that Mack Brown talked about back in 2019? I think that's going to be the talking point over the next 7-8 months is How much progress have we seen on that defensive side of the ball?
Buck, to that point, is there pressure on Jay Bateman, on the defense, on those defensive players to be better, consistently better, given the fact that Sam Howell has been so good? I mean, that's a level of pressure on those guys, right?
I think that's a fair point to make, but going back to the future, so to speak, we saw a lot of UNC freshmen come on in the second half of the season. Tony Grimes, Miles Murphy
Baller.
was, yeah. I mean, there's more than a handful of those guys. One guy I'd like to see a lot more of is Kamen Rucker. I think that guy can play ball. Jacarius Conley, and not to mention they were missing Storm Duck, for most of the season. Kyler McMichael, although not really a true freshman, but some of those other guys, Des Evans flashes, this guy, that guy. There's 6 or 7 even, very young guys or true freshmen that we saw in the second half of the season begin to have a more significant role. And let's say they have Storm Duck back. Storm Duck and Tony Grimes as your 2 corners, that's going to give you a lot of options. That both of those guys can man up on the outside, and Jason's already drooling over there thinking about that kind of thing.
That might be the best pair of corners in the ACC next year. If those 2 guys are your starters, they're both healthy and everything's as it should be. Duck and Grimes, I think you could make a strong case would be the best pair of corners in the conference. And
Tommy, you and I were talking about during the podcast that, and Jason was with us, that the guys that scratched on the stat sheet that made 1 tackle at least or whatever, during the Miami game, I think the only 2 players that were not going to be back for 2021 were Tamon Fox and Chaz Surratt. Now that's gone down to 1 player. You're talking about 10 out of the 11 players that started against Miami and against Texas A&M. And some of those guys, 10 of those 11 starters that started those 2 games, are not going to be starters probably in 2021. When Storm Duck comes back and he's ready to go, somebody's coming off that field. That's just how it's going to work.
Yeah, and Bingley Jones might send somebody to the sideline himself, and he hasn't even played yet.
That's very possible. And so I think when you start talking about 2021, a lot of those young guys that we saw in the second half of the season, and even guys that contributed before that, they're in a position, Clyde Pender, I mean, you could go on and on. They're going to be in a position to contribute at a much higher level than they did the second half of 2020. And some of the guys that are in the 2021 class, by the time we get to the second half of the season next year, guys like Kashawn Silver, Power Eccles, although I liked what I saw from Eugene Asante. And, there's a handful of guys. I think 4 out of the 5 highest rated players in this class are all on the defensive side of the ball. So early, there could be some, we don't have all the depth we'd like to have. By the time you get to game 6, 7, 8, 9, in 2021, the guys I was just talking about, they're going to be more experienced. And then you're going to have another handful of players that are going to be able to contribute on the level of that we saw from the freshmen this year. So are they going to be a better defensive team in 2022? You bet your ass they will be, because they're going to have like 3 classes worth of absolute defensive studs across the board. But I think they've got a chance, particularly, I think, in the second half of 2021. You know, they got a chance to have a very deep team of defensive war daddies on defense. And keep in mind, the guys that we saw shine the second half of 2020, they didn't have a spring practice. You know, they missed 4 or 5 weeks of conditioning, off-season conditioning. And likely they will get that this year. So I think the 2021 defense can be 4, 5, 6 points better a game than the 2020 defense. So, and maybe they'll need to be. I don't know how the running back situation will work out for North Carolina. I suspect it'll be okay, but I don't know that yet. But in terms of what I think I know, I think the 2021 defense has a chance to be really, really dynamic, and particularly when you break into the second half of the season.
That's a great point about those guys turning it up after midway. Of course, after, during Wake Forest, they got a chance to play more. It's kind of like Mack Brown going to Tour Bush back after the Sun Bowl. It's like, get in the Wake Forest game, get the freshmen in there and let them play. And it turned out
it was a market. I mean, hindsight's 2020, I know, but you put some of those guys in, you put Conley in a bunch, you start putting Murphy in and Pender, and the defense all of a sudden gets better. So you're kind of saying, well, why didn't you do this earlier? But
well, I mean, having been on the coaching side of things, the reason you don't is because those players aren't ready. And so you can have a guy who 8 out of 10 plays in practice, he's just that much better than the guy in front of him who's older. The problem is that those 2 plays are touchdowns.
Yeah.
And so you can't put him in, and you keep telling him in practice, son, I really want to play you. And you mean every word of it. Like, man, just give me a reason to play you. You can't be doing this. Like, just get that one play out of your system and we're fine. Here's what you got. And it's almost always, and this was the thing, if those listeners will remember that prior to the Wake Forest game, and those that was about where the second bye was, I believe. But I think it was prior to the Wake Forest game where I said, look, this is the post-bye game. This is the game. If we're going to see the young guys play and really take a step forward, it's going to be from here on in the season. And that's exactly what happened, because you're able in that bye to really give those guys enough reps to where now they're going to know what they're doing. They've had enough time to mess around in practice and make their mistakes and all this. And then you give them enough reps in that bye week to really see where they're at. And then they can potentially take that step forward. And those are the more talented guys. And then they get on the field and they're not totally lost. And all of a sudden they look so good. You're like, well, man, I wish we'd have played them earlier. But if you'd have played them earlier, they're running the wrong direction and they're, blowing a coverage or whatever. And that's the thing. But yeah, the defense completely changed when you got when you got the guys that you mentioned and Grimes on the field. Suddenly you started seeing some physicality, some physical differences there. And I agree with Buck. This is the team in 2021, if they have a good offseason and they're reasonably healthy, nobody's going to want to play that 2021 team late in the season. How the schedule shapes up, I think, is going to be important. You want your harder games in the second half of the season if you're that team, because nobody's going to want to play that team at the end of the season, because they're going to have had the chance to get some of those guys seasoned, and then things start to gel, and you'll have a much more complete football team.
Yeah, Notre Dame's on October 30th, so that's definitely late. So that's big to go there.
I would favor North Carolina against that Notre Dame team right now.
I want to hold you to that on the preseason prediction show.
There would have to be a lot
to the fire on that, buddy.
There would have to be a lot that will change over the offseason for me not to favor North Carolina against Notre Dame for next year.
Just remember,
they do lose a ton of seniors unless they decide to come back. You know, they got a free year.
The thing is, with Book gone, and then they're losing, well, of the guys that started at the end of the year, 4 out of the 5 offensive linemen.
If they don't decide to come back, which they could. Right.
They could, but
probably not, because they can start making money in NFL.
Yeah, you're not going to see all 5 come back.
No.
And that was such a senior heavy team that you would have to have a lot of those guys opt for that unusual, COVID permitted year, extra year, for me to favor that Notre Dame team against North Carolina next year. I think they're going to lose so much, and Carolina is actually going to be better on the defensive side in particular. That I think that's the issue. But the running back position has to really take a step forward, because I think that absolutely showed up against Texas A&M. And I know Buck, the numbers were, well, he's about the same amount of production as Najee Harris against them or whatever. That's fine, but what I saw was guys going down with on the first tackle in the open field, and there was one run, 8-minute mark of the first quarter roughly, where Henderson, and I'm not picking on him, he's a young player, he's gonna get better here, but Henderson had, he's into the second level, had an opportunity to potentially take it to the house, and got cut down by the first guy. And I've broken down, I've watched that exact play 8-10 times in the past 2 years, and Javonte Williams scores on all of them. He breaks that first tackle and takes it to the barn on all of them. And yep. I'm not sure Michael Carter even gets touched on that, given the angles there. And either of those guys scores on that play, and now you have a touchdown instead of a field goal. And that's going to be really important for the 2021 team. Normally, running back is not a real high-value position, but they're going to have to make sure, whether it's a young guy, whether it's an older guy, they're going to have to make sure that they're going to find somebody who's going to have some yards after contact, or who's going to make that initial guy miss and earn a little bit extra beyond what the offensive line does. But the one last thing for me on 2021, and I know I've gone ahead of you even introducing my segment here, Tommy, but the other big thing that sticks out to me in 2021 is they need to have a good offseason, particularly on the offensive line, because there's a lot of talent on the North Carolina offensive line. You've got 4 guys there, and I think you could argue that all 5 starters and maybe a backup could at least get a cup of water at the NFL level.
I think Azudu should be first team All-ACC next year.
Yeah, Azudu
has a chance. Player.
Azudu has a chance of being a first-round draft pick.
I mean, I don't know how much you watched him, even against A&M.
He's a stud.
He's a stud. I mean, he can do things that normally can't be done from that position.
Yeah, he is an absolute dancing bear, and he's one of those guys that with a good off season, with just working on a couple of the weaknesses that he's got and just polishing up his body, polishing up a little bit, he could be a first rounder. Could be. Thing is, they've got Tucker. Tucker should play in the NFL. McKeithen should play in the NFL. These are all guys that should play. I think Richards has a chance of playing in the NFL. He's got a long way to go, but he's got a chance. And Anderson, I mean,
came light years this year.
Yeah, he had a huge year this year, and took some steps forward to make you go, well, he's at least going to get a look. So you got 5 guys that all have the chance at least to get a look, and at least 3 who should be playing in the NFL after next year. And at the same point,
Richards, by the way, 4 of those guys have been playing together for 2 solid seasons. They'll be going into their 3rd year together.
Yeah, so
you talk about chemistry on the offensive line.
Yeah, the chemistry should be great, but there are a few places where they've underachieved their physical talent so far a little bit. And part of it is because a couple of those guys are about 10 pounds, 15 pounds overweight. The right side's a little overweight, and you see that manifest in pass protection. You see those guys where they need to be able to bend just a little bit better than they do, and their feet need to be just a little quicker. And both of those can be done with a little bit of weight loss, a little body composition. And if those guys put in the extra time with Hess in this offseason, and they're able to manage diet and make sure that they get to where they need to be, then you could be looking at the best offensive line in the ACC, one of the best in the country, and a group of guys that give Sam Howell a ton of time. But if they come into the season with the same sort of weight ratio and being just a little overweight and a little slower and more sluggish than they should be, and not bending quite as well as they should, and the conditioning not being quite where they need to be, then they're going to be a really talented line that might be able to open up major running game holes again and give you a lot, but just be frustrating enough against better defensive lines that they're just not quite where they should be. And to me, that is the key to the Carolina offense next year, if there is one. More than anything else, it's that offensive line taking the step forward to be elite with the experience that they have, matching the physical talent that they have up there. Can they take that step forward and be one of the offensive lines in contention for the best in the country? And I think they've got the talent to potentially do it, but it's just going to be, they've got to have a great offseason to get there.
Yeah, we're not used to hearing Phil Longo or Jay Bateman say many negative things about their players, even in constructive criticism ways. But what we have heard from Phil Longo is that group has struggled, and you pointed it out in one of your recent videos, Jason, with the obvious passing protections. They've really thrived off of play action. You can do that when you've got Carter and Javonte back there. So they have to make significant strides there, especially because I agree with you, Jason. You're finally going to see some of those 5 wide looks that we saw in the Orange Bowl next year, unless they're able to bring in a stud running back out of the transfer portal, or if one of these young guys just kind of grows up overnight. The other thing, though, with the offensive line, we've talked a lot this year about how much talent and potential that starting line has. They still have a lot of concerns about the backups. And so when you start talking about, I know we're focused on 2021, but when you start talking about projecting forward, if you lose Sam Howell next year and you lose some of these guys on the offensive line, where does the offense go if you don't have young guys step up? Because right now, I mean, it's Ed Montilus and it's Kieran Johnson, who's a walk-on. That's about all they trust right now out of those top 5 guys. So there has to be some development with the guys they have. They've got the numbers, but now they've got to have guys really step up and give them a legitimate 2 deep, because Notre Dame is a good example. They lost 2 stud players coming into that North Carolina game, and you couldn't tell it. Oh, they had other guys that could step up.
You could tell with the center, but they still were. Your point is that they were still great, but
right. It wasn't a huge drop off.
Yeah.
It didn't affect them against a team like Carolina. It did not affect them against a team like Carolina. It would affect them against an Alabama.
Sure, and it did. Yes. They didn't have that center against Alabama, and it absolutely did affect them.
Right. But, I mean, so, Buck, keys for North Carolina to take another step forward next year. Give me 2 or 3 keys in your opinion here on January, whatever it is, January 6th, way pre-spring practice. What has to happen for Carolina to go from 8 to 10?
I think my keys for the defense would be a very short list. Get healthy, have a good off season in the weight room, hit spring practice field ready to roll. That's about all I would say for the defense. For the offense, everybody's talked about the need to find a running back. And I agree with that. I'm not trying to minimize it, but keep in mind, 3 years ago, 2018, Javonte Williams couldn't get on the field. He had 224 yards rushing on the year. Could not get on the field.
Larry Fedora could recruit talent on the offensive side of the ball, Buck.
Well, yeah, but who was the lead rusher that year? Jordan Brown?
that season didn't
Yeah.
happen. I don't
Yeah.
remember it.
I'm just saying that as a true freshman, he was a true freshman, but so are DJ Jones, which we didn't see. So is Elijah Green, who we didn't see. They both had arguably as good a games against Western Carolina as Javonte Williams had in his freshman year. So we don't know what North Carolina has really at running back, and who knows how that's going to shake out. But I think more so than Javonte Williams having a great substantial personal leap forward from 2018 to 2019, it was a change in offense, because it's a double-edged sword. If you've got a quarterback that's capable of hitting a 75-yard touchdown pass right after he gets the kickoff, you can't devote 7, 8, 9, 10 players to the box to stop people. And Carter and Williams took advantage of that, and not taking anything away from those players. They're both great players. I think they both have a decent NFL career, but the Longo offense, people think about the air raid offense as being, very friendly to wide receivers and quarterbacks. But the biggest difference I saw when Longo came on board as offensive coordinator is how much better the running game got. It got a lot better from 18 to 19. So we'll see. I mean, maybe North Carolina certainly is not going to be able to match Carter and Williams, as in 2020, how they performed in 2020. But how big of a step back will they take? I don't know. And how will Longo compensate for that? We already talked about the 5 wide situation. So the running back position is going to be hugely important. And I think as much as that is important, they've got to find a reliable field stretcher at wide receiver. They got to find that Mack Hollins, Diamie Brown guy that could take a top off the defense, because that goes a long way towards opening up the running game and everything else you're trying to do in the offense. So those are my 2 keys. You got to have a guy that can stretch the field at wide receiver, and you got to get solid play out of your running backs. Other than that, there's not much to talk about. Josh Downs is a superhero in waiting. If they would fit me, I'd go out and buy Josh Downs pajamas now. But I think I'd have a hard time finding them in my size.
I got a website. You can order anything, any jersey you want, any type of stuff you want. It might take a while to get here, but
Okay.
you can get it.
Yeah,
Okay.
Let's put in a special request for Johnny T-shirt here, Buck. See if
Josh
they can
Down
get you some
Jamas.
Josh
Pajamas.
Downs jammies.
But those are my keys for 2021. Just in terms of the team itself, that's how I see what's got to happen on. And the other thing I think we ought to talk about briefly, at least, is special teams made a big leap forward in the second half of the season.
Yep, for sure.
And that's going to help North Carolina in 2021 if they can continue that.
Yeah, I think the biggest deal with special teams is we didn't talk about it as screwing up much. I mean, there weren't any kickoffs or punt returns for touchdowns, but there was great kickoffs. I mean, I think that's huge. But Greg, I'll let you close it. And I'll go back to the pressure thing that I talked about earlier. Is there pressure? I mean, Carolina's not going to be that's just Carolina football. That's Carolina football, and people are paying attention. How did the pressure of expectations change anything?
That's a great question. We'll have to see how the team reacts, because I think Mack said it best last week when he said, everybody was happy with the North Carolina Clemson game in 2019. Carolina, it comes within a 2-point conversion opportunity of of beating the top team in the country. But did Clemson really give UNC full attention? I didn't think so at the time. Mack doesn't think so now. But there is no doubt that Notre Dame and Miami and Texas A&M, they were well aware of what they were dealing with against North Carolina. That's a big step forward. Now it's a matter of North Carolina is not going to sneak up on any of these teams, especially with Sam Howell. You're getting a Heisman campaign going. So that's a different animal. We've talked about it a lot in various sports, but when you become the hunted as opposed to being the hunter, you can't slip up, and there is pressure. And as Mack said, any loss moving forward is a bad loss, at least in terms of how the fans and the media will perceive it. And that's a lot different than getting a pat on the back because you came close to beating Clemson, or you played really well against Notre Dame and Texas A&M. Yeah, they just pulled away late. But good job. We're proud of you. Those days are gone. And so the players have to learn to deal with that. And they have to understand that they're going to have to practice to the level they have to every single day. And Mack has said they made a big step in that regard. Last year, they were very much up and down. This year, they've been much more on point and intentional in their practice habits. That has to continue. And I think the other part of it, too, is Mack had a great line that he snuck in. And he said that North Carolina is finally recruiting guys and signing guys defensively who can get sacks without the need and the help of scheme. That means they're good enough players. It doesn't matter what they're asked to do. They can get pressure on the quarterback. That is a game-changing situation. North Carolina has not had that. And so I think you have the pressure issue where the guys have to live up to that expectation. But now you're going to start seeing some guys come in who can make plays on their own, like a De'Ami Brown on the offensive side or Javonte Williams. You're going to see those types of guys on the defensive side now. And that eliminates some of those concerns. And that allows you to put guys out there who can just be playmakers. And the defense has been lacking in that regard. So I think when you roll all those things in together, North Carolina is poised to take that next step. I think they are a team. They should be a team this fall that can get to double-digit wins. It's a lot harder to get there than it sounds. And having a guy like Sam Howell's quarterback helps in a big way making that next step.
It's just fascinating that where we've come on this podcast in 2 years and how the team has changed so much in 2 years. I think the team will be different in 2021. There's going to be some turnover. I think getting Tamon Fox back, the announcement today is huge for North Carolina. I think that makes a difference. The experience of Garrett Walston coming back on offense, I think, makes a big deal.
That was a huge – Walston coming back was a bigger deal than most people realize.
Yeah, because, I mean, he is as unsung a player, as an important player as you can get. And I think it'll be interesting and fun to watch and to cover this team. I think and I'll wrap it right here, the way they handled 2020 tells me the amount of buy-in that these guys have. And I think for you to be good, Alabama good, Clemson good, you have to have it. And I think Carolina's there. And I think Mack Brown is, like Jason said and Buck said and Greg said, right on schedule. We're going to wrap this one up. I'm going to get out of here, get everybody off of here. Spring comes in March 23rd to April 24th, something like that, Greg. I'm pretty sure the spring game's April 24th. So we'll talk a lot about football when we get closer to that. Don Callahan, Ross Martin always had the recruiting scoops. But that's going to do it for the Inside Carolina game plan and day after podcast crew for 2020/6 days in 2021. Buck Sanders, Greg Barnes, Jason Staples. Appreciate it, guys.
Enjoyed it, fellas.
Yep. It's always fun.
Thanks,
Yep. Buy my book.
And sponsor Johnny T-shirt. Y'all be safe. Everybody be safe. We'll talk again soon.